Okay, let's get started. Going to that revision question to start with. Postal acceptance rule. What is that all about? Angus?
It's agreed. It's an agreement that states when discussing a contract, all forms of communication from offer to agreement will be done with the postal system.
It touches on the postal system, but I wouldn't say it links quite to that. It may involve, like in a contract, you may discuss what communication is acceptable. So that can be an element of a contract. Let's have a think about it. There is something specific about timing that we want to dig down into. Lara?
Well, when you physically post a letter.
So when you post the letter.
Yeah, the offer is only accepted when you've posted it, but when an offer is made via email, it is accepted when it's received.
Okay, so the postal, it's a funny thing.
It's stupid. I don't like it.
It's a little bit of a, it's an unusual type of clause, and what it means is that the point in time in which an acceptance is mailed, if you have put that in the post, is when you mail it, not when it's received. So it's kind of not all that intuitive. We're going to look a little bit more about that.
That makes sense, because if there's a problem with the postal system, you may...
Yeah, now this becomes a question to say, well, if I'm buying a house off you, is it reasonable that I post an acceptance? And they might say, well, no, if it's a really high quality piece of communication, maybe you should be using certified mail, which can be tracked, or an envelope that's got tracking capacity on it, or a fax or an email or whatever that can be properly tracked. So there is some obligation there, but we're just talking in general terms. It's a little bit of a different principle.
It's just weird, because if it's accepted when you post it, what if it never gets to the other person?
Yeah, that's right.
You've accepted it.
That's the hard thing. It kind of relies. It kind of relies very much on the effectiveness of the postal service to an extent as well. But then, of course, in this day and age, we've got a whole range of ways of being sure of that communication. It's something you guys would think about in a situation. Now, we're continuing with contracts. We're starting to look at some of the exceptions to a contract, or some circumstances where people may not have to follow through. And we're particularly looking at issues around mental capacity. What if someone doesn't have the capacity to understand a contract? Is there any way around that? And secondly, we're looking at minors, people under the age of 18. So different age from the Queensland criminal law, which is 17, but under the age of 18. What are the restrictions for yourselves in entering into contracts? The first thing I want you to jot down, we haven't taken down this yet, is the postal acceptance rule. The usual rule is that acceptance must be communicated. That's our usual rule for acceptance. It must be communicated. But the postal acceptance rule is an exception to the fact that it's actually communicated. The rule is, in this case, if acceptance is made by mail, the acceptance is deemed to have taken place once the letter of acceptance has been posted. A very interesting change to this idea of actually communicating. It happens at the point in time where mail is posted. And there could be a big delay. Think about people out in country areas. When I was up in North Queensland, up in Bowen, which is not a particularly remote area, it would take 3 days for a letter to get places. It would take 1 in Brisbane. And that was not a remote area. And there were things that would even push that back further. For example, there's no mail pickup on a Friday. So if you posted something, take the whole of the weekend and a few days of transport. So no mail pickup on a Sunday, I should say.
I would think Gladstone would take a week.
Yeah. So it does take a little bit longer. The next topic we come to is capacity. An example of this: I have a friend who lives in a unit block. The unit block's got a structural problem with it, and they're trying to sell the whole block as a unit because no one will buy individual units. So they're trying to sell the whole block basically to a developer who'll knock them down and build them up. again, rebuild something. That seems to be where it has the most value, the land. It's in a flash part of Brisbane in the Ascot area. One of the people of the 5 is a 72-year-old gentleman who is struggling to make decisions. And they've signed up to one real estate agent, and he, without really understanding, signed up to a second real estate agent, including fees of $1,500 for advertising. So he is struggling to get out of that contract that he signed. And the important issue will be that around capacity. Did he really understand what was going on in that situation? So this is what it refers to, the ability of certain people or groups of people. For example, people who are under the age of 18. What ability do they have to enter in a contract? There are specific restrictions on some people, right, that say you cannot do this. You don't have the capacity at this point in time to enter in a contract. For example, people who are bankrupt or in jail have restrictions on their ability to buy or sell land, so property effectively, purchase a car or borrow money from a bank. There are specific restrictions there. Give you guys another minute to get those down. And as I said, being underage, under the age of 18, that's a specific area that we'll look at in a second. We've got a couple of interesting cases. Right. John.
If they did do it with the minor, it's sort of like using them as
That's the idea, is that they don't want people to be exploited.
they're like naive to what.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we don't want that. Yeah, we don't want that naivety to be exploited. In fact, one of those subtle things is when they are allowed to enter in a contract as someone who's under the age of 18, and there are exceptions, that when they turn 18, they should make a recommitment to that contract, so that anything they've signed as someone under the age of what we see as an adult, when you get to 18 again, you're checking that as an adult this contract is still valid.
Oh, and does that apply to older people as well? Like if they're...
There are different restrictions here, and so we'll look at those. So they'll fall more into this general idea of mental incapacity. So if someone's mind was unable to not understand the nature of the agreement, and the person who was making the agreement was aware of this, they shouldn't enter into that. Lara.
If you are disabled in
Yep.
some way,
Yep.
and you have a carer or a guardian,
Yep.
do they sign on behalf of you?
Yeah, they can do. There's a part of the law system called the Adult Guardianship Tribunal. And so if you are lacking capacity to make decisions yourselves, that tribunal will set up a structure where you can do that. Part of what happens there might be putting in place an endure powering of attorney. So my parents have asked me to play this role for them, and it means if they haven't got the capacity to make decisions for themselves as they get older, I will make decisions for them. Right, so that's hard. And so I've seen my grandfather who went through, into a nursing home, went through dementia. They had someone who was able to make decisions on his behalf. I think it was a trusted family member who did that. And that's how it works. So yeah, maybe someone appointed. But if someone hasn't done that paperwork, there is a whole tribunal that deals with cases like that and says how do we best support people in this situation. So jot this down. So there's those two levels, right? And there's quite a funny case we've got on the next page, right? Quite a funny case. I know you guys think legal studies is basically a bundle of laughs, but this one did amuse me a little bit. It's illness or incapacity. Being drunk is incapacity. Now, there is an interesting thing in that. Remember, from a criminal element, you don't get to say, oh, I was drunk and therefore I take less responsibility for my actions. In fact, in New South Wales, they've gone the other way. They've gone and said if you're under the influence of alcohol and you assault someone, the consequences, the legal consequences, are now more significant, because they had those couple of deaths that came from what they're branding as a coward punch, what we used to refer to as a king hit. And so they said, well, not only are we not prepared to say that being under the influence of alcohol diminishes your ability to make decisions. We're going to say that you have to take responsibility for the state you are in, and therefore the consequences is high. Mind you, there is one situation. Does anyone remember back? There is one situation where being under the influence of drugs can diminish the responsibility you have to take for a criminal action. Does anyone remember what it was, John?
If you take them without knowing that.
Yes. So if your drink was spiked, for example, if someone else, if you can show that you weren't aware that you had drunk alcohol, taken drugs, whatever, that is maybe a partial defence. Maybe a partial defence. So last minute to get this down. Remember the second thing. The person making the contract was aware or should have been aware of the illness. So you should have picked up that this person, for whatever it is, whether it was behavioural, whether you knew their background, that this person wasn't capable of entering in the style of contract that they entered into. Anyone still writing? Just have a last look. We're getting through this very nicely. Here's the case, and I do want you to jot this down because there's two elements to this case that are interesting, but I find it a great case. Right? This guy has come, I take it has probably come home from a big night out, right, and he's drunk. And so on the way home, of all the things to do, he buys a house at an auction. Right? He stops in at an auction and he buys a house. Now, he sobers up, and he then decides, even when he's sober, he says, yeah, I'm happy with the house I happened to buy when I was walking home drunk. Which seems like a strange decision, but maybe he was looking for houses at the time and decided this house was going to be good. So he has then sobered up, and this is very important in the facts, he's then sobered up and agreed to be bound by the contract. Now, he then wanted to get out of the contract. He tried to get out of the contract, but the courts held that he could have been let out of the contract if the only time he'd been involved in making it was when he was drunk coming home. However, because he had subsequently agreed to be bound by the contract when he was sober, the contract was going to go ahead. And there's a real subtlety of terms here that I want you guys, particularly guys who aspire to be A students, to think about here. There's a difference between a contract that is void because of something that happened in the making of the contract and a contract that is voidable. Right? That means someone can get out of it. Because this contract was kept in place. It wasn't completely void. This contract was said, yeah, you can follow through. Now, it was voidable because if he had, when he sobered up and said, no, I don't want to be involved in the contract, it would have flowed through. But because he then agreed to it when he was sober as well, the contract was allowed to go on. So the idea was that it was voidable, that is, he could have got out of it if he had wanted, rather than it being completely void, completely illegitimate. So just jot down this Matthews versus Baxter, 1873 case. John?
Could you just say again what void and voidable means?
Yes, the difference between void and voidable. If a contract is void, it means that it can't go ahead. It's completely unable to be put in place. It can't happen. That's void. If it's voidable, it means that one party's got the right to get out of the contract, but it could still go ahead. Okay, the contract could still exist if both parties then agree to it. So in this case, it was once he sobered up after the auction, he found out he'd bought a house walking home while drunk, and he said, yeah, okay, I'm happy with that house. Nice work, me. But if he had have said at that point in time, no, I didn't have the capacity to buy a house at the auction, and it's probably obvious to the auctioneer, maybe he still had a drink in his hands, maybe he wasn't able to stand up, maybe he threw up twice during the auction. I don't know, but if there are signs he's clearly drunk, then that would be, and I imagine, they would have different signs, like for example, he probably hasn't been through any of the inspections of the house, he wouldn't have been known to them before that, it would have been unusual for someone just to, show up walking home, sober or not, and buy a house.
Yeah.
Oh, I take it he's walking home early the next morning. It's been a big night for Baxter. Okay. So, yes, he's doing the walk of shame home in daylight hours, and he's stopped in and bought a house. So jot these details of this case down. Okay, the next topic is, we get into this area of minors. And we've got some interesting questions around minors. M-I-N-O-R-S, not people who work down mines, but people who are under the age of 18. And as John alluded to before, the idea is that we're looking to protect these young adults from bad decisions on the basis of youth or inexperience. Let me just change that, because there's actually a lack of experience. We generally say, according to the law, that people under the age of 18 can't enter into contracts. However, there are exceptions that we're going to look at. But in the general terms, a bank can come, I go and do my banking, and they might suggest to me that I need a credit card or a personal loan or something like that. Well, a bunch of those things that they can't give to you guys because you can't enter into those contracts. Yeah, that's a really specific one, and we're going to look at that. Okay, so because that's a very important one, and one of the elements of that is trying to build this idea that John gave us, that we don't want to exploit young adults. But now you're saying, well, an employment contract is actually beneficial. There are beneficial contracts for service that we'll look at that say, yeah, you can do that. And a key one is this idea of apprenticeship. Imagine if you took the opportunity to get an apprenticeship away from people of 16 or 17 or 18 because they can't enter into an agreement in this situation. So that is, yes, you've already found one of the exceptions.
I said when I was 14.
Yeah, yep. Okay. First is ratification. That's that process where if a person's under the age of 18 and they've been allowed to enter into a contract, they ratify that when they turn 18. So what that means is, if you make a contract for one of the areas you're allowed to when you turn 16, even in that case, as you go to an adult, you've got to check it and ratify that agreement when you're 18 so that it doesn't have negative consequences on you as an adult. So that's the first process in these exceptions to a minor not being able to enter into a contract. So jotting this down. So we've looked at ratification. The second thing is contracts for necessaries. This is another exception. As a young person, you can contract for those things that a minor, person under the age of 18, needs to maintain the standard of living they currently enjoy. This is what allows people under the age of 18 to enter into contracts for accommodation. You might be 17 when you move down to Brisbane to go to university. This is how you can enter into a contract, provided the standard of accommodation is reasonable. Okay, if you've been living in just a nice, normal suburban house, and you entered into a contract for a $20,000 a week penthouse in at South Bank, I think that they would say that you didn't have to be bound by that because it's not consistent with the standard of living you currently enjoy. If it's just a normal average unit, then that would be reasonable. John?
So does it depend, how wealthy you are?
There is an element that depends. Someone who has been living for a period of time, for example, in the caravan park, there may be different as to what things they might be allowed to contract into. But what we see in reality is there generally are like broad exemptions.
But what if they're just like a chilled out millionaire who just wants to live in a caravan park?
Well, yeah, someone who's a millionaire and under the age of 18, right? Or you're saying they're children?
No, then like, what if their parents are just generally loaded?
Yeah, and there's a lot of evidence,
And
right?
their pocket money's like 10,000.
A lot of evidence. There's a couple of academics in the United States, guys Stanley and Danko, who studied millionaires, and they find actually millionaires don't live in big fancy houses and drive flash cars at all. They live in basic houses. They live very basic lives. That's part of the reasons why they've accumulated a significant level of wealth. They don't spend a lot of stuff. But yeah, it still does come back to this standard of living that they currently enjoy. What is reasonable based on their previous experiences? And this is how they can be allowed, necessary, so you can be allowed to sign a contract for those things. We look at Nash versus Inman, 1908, quite an old case, but they were looking at what happens around the purchase of waistcoats. So this young person had entered into a contract to buy 11 what is described as fancy waistcoats, and it was decided that this was beyond a necessary. Right? This was an indulgent thing, and they didn't have to be held to that contract. And it was quite a bit of money back in those days. Right? So it's quite a big thing. They didn't. Now, he was not forced to go ahead with that purchase. He was allowed to get out of that contract. Okay, here is the question, and I don't want you guys to write this down, which we're going to talk about as an answer. Can minors sign contracts for example, schoolies accommodation, mobile phones, and cars? Right, what are our thoughts on those three things? The last slide for the day, and this is we've talked about this. A beneficial contract for service. This is exactly what we talked about before. Signs a contract of service that is beneficial to them, for example, an apprenticeship with an employer. And we've got this Roberts versus Gray case. Roberts was the adult, and he was a very good billiards player. And Gray was apprenticeship to him, and the basis was that Gray was going to go and help him complete a tour, and at the same time would learn about billiards. But Gray tried to get out of the contract. The judge ruled that even though Gray was a minor, it was an enforceable contract because it was a beneficial contract of service for him. He had the benefits that came from being an apprentice. So it was, even though he was under the age of 18, he was allowed to have entered into this contract.
You know like the show with Eddie Maguire, Hot Seat?
Yeah.
Are you allowed to go on that if you're under 18?
I don't know what the rules are. I have seen for some game shows the rules are that you can't go on under the age of 18, but they have game shows specifically for kids, on kids' TV. So I don't know if that's a problem. You think that's entering into a form of contract, do you?
Well, if you win.
So yeah, so it's a fairly beneficial contract, isn't it? There's no downside, as I understand. There's no fee to go along or something like that. And yeah, unless you make an idiot of yourself on national television. But basically, that's not too likely. I think they don't try and go out to embarrass themselves. What I think would be more interesting is, let's say someone under the age of 18 was on a Big Brother type show. I think that you can argue that is a little more exploitive because there's not just like a one-off prize at the end. It's very much an intrusion onto your lifestyle over an extended period of time. The compensation is not particularly high. They talk about getting a payment of $400 to $700 a week for most contestants on those sort of reality TV shows, which I think is not a lot of money. So that might be a little bit different. I'd be very surprised if they had people under the age of 18 involved in those shows.